Mary Johnson had worked in the same tall glass building for more than 15 years. Every evening as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, she quietly pushed her cleaning cart through the heavy glass doors. She wore the same simple uniform every night: blue shirt, black pants, and sturdy shoes that never made a sound on the polished floors. To the people who worked there during the day, she was only the custodian. They passed her in the lobby, some with polite nods, most without even looking at her. To them, she was invisible, but Mary noticed everything. While she swept the marble floors and wiped down the conference tables, she listened to the echo of hurried footsteps and the whispers of tired employees rushing home. In the quiet hours of the night, the building felt like it belonged to her alone. She knew every corner, every locked room, and every creak of the elevator doors. The office plants, the artwork on the walls, even the buzzing of the lights above felt like old companions. Her co-workers in the janitorial team admired her for her discipline. Mary never missed a shift, never complained, and never asked for favors. She was always on time, always careful, and always calm. Even when younger workers grew tired and quit after only a few months, Mary stayed. Some thought she had no other choice, that this was the only life she could afford. Others pitied her, whispering that after so many years she must be stuck forever. But Mary never explained herself. She let them believe what they wanted, while she carried her own secret deep inside her heart. Every evening, as the executives left in their luxury cars, Mary walked past them unnoticed. They spoke loudly, laughing at jokes she was not supposed to hear, sometimes even complaining about people like her. To them, she was part of the background, like the walls or the carpets, necessary but unimportant. Still, she never reacted. She smiled politely if anyone greeted her, then returned to her work with quiet dignity. The CEO, Richard Adams, was the worst of them all. He would often sneer when he passed her, making comments about wasted labor and dead weight. He believed people like Mary had no ambition, no intelligence, no value beyond scrubbing and dusting. Once he dropped his empty coffee cup on the floor in front of her and said, "That's your job, isn't it?" Mary bent down, picked it up, and carried on as if nothing had happened. Inside, though, she remembered every word, every insult, every sign of arrogance. Mary's silence was not weakness. She was watching. She was listening. For 15 years, she studied the way people behaved when they thought no one important was looking. She saw kindness in some of the younger workers who smiled at her, and cruelty in others who treated her like she was invisible. She saw how executives made decisions, how they treated employees, and how they spoke of money, power, and control. And every detail she stored away quietly like pages in a secret diary. Sometimes, when she walked past the top floor where the CEO's office stood, she would pause for a moment and look out of the window. The city lights stretched endlessly, glowing like stars. To anyone else, it was just a view. But to Mary, it was a reminder of her true place in the world, a place no one around her had yet discovered. She knew the company better than most who worked there. She had been there longer than nearly all of them. And more than that, she had a connection no one suspected. At night, when her shift ended and she returned to her modest apartment, she would sit quietly with a cup of tea and reflect. The world believed she was just a custodian, someone whose name would never appear on the company's walls, whose presence would never be remembered. But Mary was patient. She believed that time would reveal the truth, and when it did, the shock would change everything. Her neighbors sometimes asked why she stayed in such a demanding job for so many years. Couldn't she find something easier? Didn't she want to rest? Mary would only smile and say, "It pays the bills." That was the simple answer she gave, though it was not the real one. In her heart, she knew she had a reason far greater than anyone could guess. The quiet custodian walked the same hallways, pushed the same cart, and wore the same uniform night after night. But hidden behind her calm expression and steady hands was a secret strong enough to shake the very foundation of the company. The people around her saw only a woman with a mop. What they could not see was the power she carried, the knowledge she held, and the patience that kept her waiting until the perfect moment arrived. For 15 years, Mary swept the floors of her own company, and no one, not even the arrogant CEO, ever suspected the truth. Richard Adams was the kind of man who filled every room with his presence, not because people admired him, but because they feared him. Tall, always dressed in expensive suits and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who thought the world belonged to him. Richard had been the CEO of the company for nearly a decade. His voice carried like thunder in meetings, sharp and cutting, leaving employees scrambling to meet his impossible demands. To Richard, power was everything. He measured success not by loyalty or kindness, but by numbers on a chart and the size of his office. He believed leaders had the right to step on others to rise higher. To him, employees were tools, replaceable, disposable, and never equal. He bragged often that he could fire anyone without hesitation, and many had watched their careers end with a single wave of his hand. The halls of the company echoed with whispers about him. Cold as ice, some said. Cruel but clever, others muttered. He enjoyed the reputation. Fear kept people in line, and Richard thrived on that. He wanted respect, but he didn't care if it came from admiration or terror. As long as people bowed to his authority, he was satisfied. When Richard passed Mary, the custodian, he hardly saw her at all. If his eyes did land on her, it was only to sneer or toss a careless insult. Some people never aim higher, he once said loudly, making sure others could hear as Mary quietly wiped down a glass table. 15 years of mopping floors? Pathetic. He chuckled at his own remark, not noticing the way Mary's hand slowed for just a second before she carried on, as if she hadn't heard. To Richard, Mary was less than a shadow. He treated her existence as part of the furniture, there but unimportant. What he never imagined was that this woman, the one he disrespected most, was the one with the greatest power of all. But Richard lived in his own world, blinded by his pride. He believed he was untouchable, and his arrogance only grew year after year. He loved showing off his wealth. Employees often saw him pull up in his sleek black car, the kind only the richest could afford. He would strut through the lobby with his leather briefcase, tossing his keys to the valet without even looking at the man's face. He spoke loudly on his phone, often bragging about million-dollar deals or mocking rivals in the industry. His arrogance had no limits. Inside meetings, Richard thrived on humiliation. If a manager stumbled while giving a presentation, he would laugh and cut them off. If you can't even explain your own numbers, why are you still employed here? He'd bark, sending shivers down the spines of everyone in the room. People dreaded being in his presence, but none dared to challenge him. Losing his favor often meant losing their jobs. Yet for all his confidence, Richard had one blind spot. He underestimated people. He believed those with less money, less education, or less power had nothing to offer. This weakness followed him everywhere, shaping the way he led the company. He saw himself as a king surrounded by servants, and in that kingdom, the custodian who swept the floors at night was, in his mind, the lowest of them all. What Richard didn't know was that Mary had been watching him. Night after night, year after year, she saw the way he treated others, the words he used, the pride in his step. She listened to the way he spoke about loyalty, while firing loyal employees without hesitation. She noticed how he took credit for the work of others and punished mistakes with cruelty. Mary's silence was not weakness. It was patience. And while Richard grew bolder in his arrogance, Mary stored away every moment like fuel for a fire that had not yet begun to burn. One evening, Richard passed Mary in the hallway. He had just come out of a heated call and his temper was high. "Move," he snapped, shoving past her cleaning cart. The mop bucket tipped, spilling water across the polished floor. Richard didn't pause. He didn't apologize. He walked away as if nothing had happened. Mary knelt down quietly, wringing out the mop and cleaning up the mess he caused. But as she worked, her eyes followed his retreating figure, calm and steady. In that instant, the difference between them was clear. Richard thought he was in control, but Mary knew something he didn't. He had power in his title, but she had power in the truth. And the truth was waiting, silent and patient for the perfect day to arrive. Richard continued ruling his company like a tyrant, unaware that the ground beneath him was already shifting. His arrogance blinded him to the possibility that the woman he insulted, the woman he treated as nothing, was the one who would decide his fate. For now, Richard Adams was the arrogant CEO, but his reign was already counting down even if he couldn't see it. The company was a world of voices. In the day, it buzzed with phones ringing, keyboards tapping, and executives rushing with coffee cups in their hands. But at night, when most of the lights dimmed and silence filled the halls, little whispers still seemed to linger. They were not loud, not sharp, but soft. Words passed from one worker to another. Rumors carried like secrets drifting on the air. And at the center of many of these whispers was Mary, the quiet custodian. She had been there for so long that people couldn't help but wonder about her. New employees would whisper to each other, "She's been here for years. How does she do it? Why hasn't she left?" Some said she must not have any other choice. Others guessed she was too old to start over, too tired to dream of more. A few even joked cruelly, saying, "Maybe she just likes mopping floors." But Mary never answered their curiosity. She walked past the whispers with her head held high, her mop gliding across the floors like a painter's brush. She did not argue. She did not explain. She simply worked. Still, the whispers grew. Some employees noticed something different about her. She carried herself with more dignity than most. She was calm even when insulted. When people were nervous about meetings or worried about losing their jobs, Mary moved with the patience of someone who seemed untouchable, almost like she knew something they didn't. "She's strange," one secretary whispered in the break room. "I've never seen her angry. Not once." "She must need the money badly," another replied. "Or maybe," a third voice said softly, "maybe she just doesn't care what we think." There were even stories that floated around like myths. One said she once turned down an offer to work in another department, as if she preferred cleaning over an easier job. Another claimed she had saved a manager's child during a fire drill years ago, though no one knew if it was true. Mary never confirmed or denied these tales. She simply kept on with her routine, as steady as the ticking of a clock. But in truth, Mary did care about the whispers, just not in the way people thought. Every rumor, every assumption, every careless word was proof of how little people truly knew her. And every whisper reminded her why she had chosen this path, to see the truth of those around her unmasked by power or status. At times, she overheard the whispers directly. She would walk into a hallway just as two interns hushed their voices, or pass by the copy room while managers chuckled behind her back. She never stopped to defend herself. She smiled gently, sometimes nodding as if their words didn't matter at all. But inside she remembered. The whispers weren't only about her either. Mary also listened to the way employees whispered about the CEO. Late at night, when the office was quiet, she sometimes caught the sighs of tired workers staying overtime. "He's going to fire half the staff again," one would whisper. "He doesn't care about anyone." Another would whisper back, "We're just numbers to him." Nothing more. The fear in their voices lingered in the halls even after they left. Mary heard it all. She understood it all. It fascinated her how different people were when they thought no one important was listening. Executives gossiped about each other in corners. Assistants whispered about unfair treatment. Workers whispered about dreams of leaving, of starting over somewhere else. And through it all, Mary quietly gathered their words, piecing together a picture of the company more honest than any report. To most people, whispers were just noise. But to Mary, whispers were truth. People whispered what they dared not say aloud, and in those hushed tones their real selves were revealed. There was one night that stood out. A young intern, staying late to finish a project, sat in the hallway looking defeated. Mary passed by with her cart, and the intern didn't even notice her at first. Then, in a broken whisper, she said to herself, "I can't keep doing this. He treats us like trash. I feel invisible." Mary stopped for a moment. She wanted to speak to comfort her, but instead she only gave a small smile when their eyes finally met. The intern looked startled, then embarrassed, as if she'd been caught exposing her pain. Mary only said softly, "You're not invisible." Then she moved on, her mop gliding across the floor, leaving the intern staring after her. That was Mary's gift. To hear what others ignored, to see what others missed. The whispers in the hallways told her more about the company than any board meeting ever could. They told her who was kind, who was cruel, who was broken, and who was strong. And they reminded her every single night why she waited. The whispers thought they knew her story. They thought she was poor, desperate, or stuck. They thought she was powerless. But none of them knew the truth. And none of them could imagine that one day, the very woman they whispered about would walk into the boardroom, not as a custodian, but as the one who owned it all. For now, the whispers filled the halls. But soon those whispers would turn into gasps of shock when the truth finally came out. Years before Mary Johnson ever picked up her first mop in that building, her life had already taken a turn that no one could have imagined. Her uncle, a quiet man with sharp business sense, had been one of the earliest investors in the company. He had helped build it from the ground up, back when it was just a small office with borrowed furniture and big dreams. He never sought fame or recognition. He worked in the background, buying shares, holding meetings in dusty rooms, and slowly building a fortune. Mary had always been close to him. As a little girl, she would sit on his porch, listening as he explained how businesses rose and fell. He would point at the city skyline and say, "Power doesn't always sit in the tallest office, Mary. Sometimes it hides where no one bothers to look." At the time, she didn't understand. She only smiled, memorizing his words without realizing how important they would become. When he passed away, he left her something astonishing: a majority stake in the very company she would one day sweep floors in. Overnight, Mary became the quiet owner of a business worth millions. But instead of announcing herself, instead of marching into the boardroom and claiming her rightful chair, she did something no one expected. She took a uniform. She took a mop. She stepped into the building not as an owner but as a custodian. Why? Because Mary wanted to see the truth. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. He had always warned her that people show their true selves not when they are watched, but when they believe no one important is paying attention. If she appeared as the owner, everyone would bow, flatter, and pretend. But if she came as a custodian, invisible to their eyes, she would see who they really were. So night after night, Mary worked quietly, blending into the background. She studied the executives as they bragged about their power, listened to managers who whispered about profits while mocking lower staff, and watched the CEO, Richard Adams, as he strutted like a king through the halls. They thought she was nothing. They treated her as nothing. And that was exactly what she wanted, for now. Mary kept her ownership secret even from the board. The shares were locked in her name, protected by trusted lawyers who understood her plan. She attended no shareholder meetings, signed papers quietly in private, and asked her advisors to keep her role hidden until the day she was ready. She wanted to learn. She wanted to wait, and she learned everything. She saw how Richard made deals that harmed workers but made him richer. She saw how he pushed loyal employees out with cruel efficiency. She noticed which managers smiled at janitors and which ones spat insults behind their backs. She saw who stayed late to finish their work and who left early while others carried the load. The company became like a book, and Mary read every page with patient eyes. Every insult directed at her, every careless laugh as she passed by with her mop, every whisper in the hallway. It all went into the story she was writing in her mind. A story that would one day end with a revelation no one would see coming. Sometimes, when she was alone in the top-floor boardroom late at night, polishing the long wooden table, she would pause and place her hand flat on its surface. She would look around at the leather chairs, at the view of the city glowing beyond the glass, and whisper to herself, "This is mine. They just don't know it yet." There were moments when she felt the weight of the secret. Carrying power that no one recognized was not easy. Some nights she longed to shout the truth, to see the shock on Richard's face as she revealed who really owned the company he ruled like a tyrant. But she held back. She reminded herself that patience was her greatest weapon. If she revealed too soon, they would change, pretend to be kind, mask their true selves. She wanted to see them raw, unfiltered, and she had seen enough to know what kind of leader Richard truly was. For 15 years, she walked in the shadows of her own empire, gathering evidence not on paper but in memory. The arrogance, the cruelty, the greed. It piled higher and higher until the burden became almost unbearable. But Mary never flinched. She swept, she scrubbed, she listened, and she waited. No one knew the truth. Not the managers who mocked her. Not the employees who pitied her. Not even Richard Adams, who believed himself untouchable. To them, she was just a woman with a mop. To herself, she was a queen waiting for her crown. The secret of her hidden ownership was like a storm building silently on the horizon. No one could see it yet, but one day lightning would strike and the storm would break open. And when it did, every whisper, every insult, every arrogant laugh would come crashing down in a single moment of truth. For now, she remained the hidden owner, the quiet custodian who swept the floors of the company she already controlled. But soon, her silence would end. The night that changed everything did not look different from any other at first. The sky outside was dark, The office lights glowed faintly, and Mary pushed her cart through the familiar hallways as she had done thousands of times before. Her hands gripped the mop, her body moved in steady rhythm, but her heart was heavy. For 15 years she had waited, patient and silent, but that night something snapped. It began with voices. From the CEO's office, Richard's deep laughter echoed down the hall. He was not alone. A few executives sat with him, drinking late into the night. Mary had not meant to stop, but as she passed, she heard her own name. "She's still here?" Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. 15 years and still scrubbing toilets. Can you imagine being that useless? If she were smarter, she would have quit years ago. The others laughed with him, the sound sharp, cruel, and echoing through the thin walls. One man added, "Maybe she likes being invisible. People like her don't dream big. They clean up after those of us who matter." Mary froze outside the door. She stood quietly, her mop resting against the wall, her hands trembling slightly. She had heard insults before. She had endured silence, stares, even pity. But this was different. This was a knife twisting deeper, a reminder of every year she had stayed hidden, waiting for the right moment. Richard's voice rose again, mocking and loud. "You know, if I could, I'd fire her just to save a few dollars." Imagine the headlines. CEO sacks janitor after 15 years. Who would even care? She's nothing. That word, nothing, echoed in Mary's chest. For years she had been patient. For years she had endured. But now the time for waiting was over. In that single moment, Mary knew. Her silence had lasted long enough. She turned away from the door and walked down the hallway, her steps steady, her face calm. But inside her, something powerful awoke. She was not just a custodian. She was not invisible. She was the owner. And soon everyone, including Richard, would know it. That night, when her shift ended, Mary did not go home and drink her usual cup of tea. Instead, she sat at her small wooden desk, pulled out a file she had kept hidden for years, and laid it open. Inside were the documents, proof of her majority ownership, signed and sealed. Her uncle's legacy, her birthright. Her hands rested on the papers for a long time. She remembered her uncle's words, his lessons about patience, about truth. She had lived those lessons faithfully. But he had also told her something else. Power is not meant to be hidden forever. Power is meant to be used when the time is right. And tonight, Mary felt the right time had come. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across the city, Mary walked into the building not in her custodian's uniform, but in a simple but elegant suit. Her co-workers stared, confused. Some didn't even recognize her without her mop and cart. She carried herself differently now, her steps steady and sure, her eyes filled with quiet fire. For the first time in 15 years, Mary was not blending into the background. She was stepping forward. She went straight to the boardroom where a meeting was scheduled. Richard was already there, laughing loudly with the executives, planning another round of layoffs. The atmosphere was arrogant, careless, and smug, until the door opened and Mary walked in. At first, silence fell because no one understood. Richard's eyebrows arched in mock amusement. "What is this? The janitor wants to join our meeting?" He sneered, leaning back in his chair. The room chuckled with him, but Mary didn't flinch. She placed the documents on the table, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not here as a custodian," she said. "I'm here as the majority shareholder of this company." The laughter died instantly. Richard's smirk froze on his face, his eyes narrowing as if she had spoken nonsense. But the board members reached for the papers, flipping through them with wide eyes. Signatures, stamps, proof. Richard leaned forward, his voice low, almost desperate. "What kind of trick is this?" Mary met his gaze with quiet strength. "No trick. I've owned this company for years. I've watched how you run it. I've listened to how you treat people. And I've heard enough." The room was silent, heavy with shock. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he looked small, cornered, powerless. In that silence, Mary realized something. The breaking point had not only come for her. It had come for him too. His reign, built on arrogance and cruelty, was crumbling right before his eyes. That night's insults had pushed her to act. The word nothing had lit a fire that could not be put out. And now Mary stood tall in the very room where Richard had once laughed at her. She was no longer the quiet custodian. She was the true owner. And her time had come. The boardroom was a place of power. Long polished table, leather chairs, city skyline glowing behind the tall windows. It was where decisions were made that shaped lives, where Richard Adams ruled like a king. On that morning, he expected another easy victory. He had gathered his executives to discuss new layoffs, another move that would cut jobs but line his pockets. The men and women around him nodded nervously, ready to agree with whatever he said. But when the door opened and Mary Johnson walked in, the entire room changed. She wasn't wearing her custodian's uniform. She wasn't pushing a mop or carrying her cleaning cart. She walked in with a file under her arm, dressed in a simple suit, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. No one knew how to react. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking. "What is this? Did someone forget to lock the janitor's closet?" His voice dripped with mockery. The room erupted with polite chuckles, desperate to stay on his side. Mary did not answer right away. She placed the file on the table and slowly slid the documents forward. The papers bore her name in black ink, proof of her ownership, sealed and signed years ago. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "I'm not here as your custodian," she said. "I am here as the majority owner of this company." The room froze. The executives looked at each other, their laughter dying instantly. The sound of paper being shuffled filled the silence as one of the board members pulled the documents toward him, scanning them with wide eyes. Another leaned over, whispering in disbelief. Richard's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, scoffing. "This is a joke," he snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "A stunt. Who put you up to this?" But Mary didn't flinch. She looked him straight in the eye. "It's no joke. I've owned this company for 15 years. While you laughed at me, while you dismissed me, I was watching. I've seen how you treat your workers, how you treat this company as if it were your personal toy, and I've stayed silent long enough." The boardroom felt heavier with every word she spoke. Some executives lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. Richard's face turned red. He stood, slamming his hands on the table. "Do you expect us to believe that a janitor has been secretly running this company?" Mary's calm smile was sharper than any blade. Not running, watching, and now leading. A hush fell over the room. For the first time, Richard looked unsure. He glanced at the board members for support, but their silence told him everything. They had seen the documents. They knew the truth. One of the senior board members cleared his throat nervously. "It appears she's telling the truth, Richard. These documents are valid. She owns the controlling shares." The words struck the room like thunder. Richard staggered back a step, his pride cracking. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice shaking for the first time. But Mary did not waver. She picked up the file again, placed it firmly in front of her, and said, "It's very possible. You just never looked past the mop in my hand." The executives shifted uncomfortably, realizing the weight of what was happening. The woman they had ignored, the one they had dismissed as invisible, was standing before them as the true leader. The irony was unbearable, and yet it was undeniable. Richard tried to laugh again, but the sound was hollow. "So what now? You expect us to follow you?" Mary's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "I don't expect, I demand. This company has been broken under your arrogance, but that ends today. I won't let anyone be treated as invisible again." The silence that followed was unlike any the boardroom had ever known. For years, Richard's word had been law. But now his empire was crumbling, undone not by a rival executive, not by a competitor, but by the woman he had mocked, ignored, and underestimated. One by one, the board members nodded, slowly shifting their allegiance. They weren't just agreeing with Mary because the documents proved her ownership. They were agreeing because her presence, her calm strength, made them realize she had always been the one with true authority. Richard's fists clenched. His voice trembled as he tried one last time. "You're nothing but a cleaner." Mary leaned forward, her words slicing through the air. "And yet today the cleaner just cleaned house." The room gasped. Richard's face drained of color. In that instant, the power dynamic flipped completely. The man who had ruled with arrogance was now powerless, trapped by his own blindness. And Mary Johnson, the quiet custodian who had swept the floors for 15 years, stood revealed as the true owner, and the leader who would reshape the company's future. The revelation was complete. The whispers that once followed her would soon become headlines. And for Richard Adams, The boardroom that had once been his throne had turned into his downfall. The air in the boardroom felt heavy, like a storm pressing down on every shoulder. Papers lay scattered across the long wooden table, the proof of Mary's ownership staring every executive in the face. No one dared to speak. Some avoided eye contact, others fidgeted nervously, but all of them knew the truth now. The woman they had dismissed for years was the real power in the building. Richard Adams stood at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. He looked less like a confident CEO and more like a man drowning, grasping for air. His eyes darted from Mary to the documents, then to the board members who sat frozen in silence. "This is madness," Richard barked, his voice louder than it needed to be, almost desperate. "You people can't possibly think this. This janitor is going to run the company." The word janitor stung in the air, but Mary didn't flinch. She had heard it too many times before. Instead, she stepped forward, calm, composed, her voice steady. "You've had your chance, Richard. For years, you treated people like they were disposable. You turned this company into your personal kingdom. But it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me." The board members shifted, glancing between them. Some looked ashamed. Others seemed almost relieved. For years, they had followed Richard's orders out of fear. Now they saw a chance for change. Richard slammed his fist against the table. "I built this place, me. Without me, it would collapse." Mary met his anger with quiet strength. "You didn't build it. You bled it dry. You fired loyal workers, mocked those beneath you, and chased profits without caring who you crushed. You thought power meant stepping on people. But power," she paused, her eyes steady, "is about lifting people up." The silence that followed was sharp, like a knife cutting through the air. Everyone felt it. Even Richard. Then, with a voice that carried more weight than any shouted order, Mary spoke the words no one ever expected to hear. "Richard Adams," she said firmly, "you're fired." The room froze. The words echoed against the glass walls, bouncing off the polished floor. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Richard blinked, his mouth opening and closing, his face pale. You can't fire me," he sputtered. His voice cracked. "I'm the CEO." Mary stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Not anymore. As majority owner, I have the authority, and I am exercising it now." Gasps rippled around the table. The executives exchanged stunned looks. Some almost smiled. Not out of cruelty, but out of sheer disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The untouchable Richard Adams, the man who fired others without mercy, was now on the receiving end of his own weapon. Richard's face turned red with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Mary. "You'll regret this. You don't know what you're doing. This company needs me." But Mary only shook her head. "This company doesn't need a tyrant. It needs a leader. And from this day forward, that's who I'll be." Her words landed with finality. There was no room for argument. Richard looked around the room, searching for support, for even one ally to defend him. But none came. The same executives who once bowed to his power now kept their eyes down, unwilling to fight for a man who had ruled them with fear. The silence told him everything. He was alone. Slowly, Richard realized what had happened. The empire he had controlled with arrogance had been taken from him in a single moment. Not by a rival executive, not by an enemy corporation, but by the woman he had mocked as nothing. His legs felt weak as he reached for his briefcase, his fingers trembling. The weight of humiliation pressed harder than any burden he had ever known. For the first time in his career, Richard Adams walked out of the boardroom not as a leader, not as a king, but as a man defeated. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Mary remained standing at the head of the table, her hands resting calmly on the documents that had revealed the truth. She took a deep breath. For 15 years she had waited for this moment. 15 years of silence, patience, and endurance, all leading to this. The boardroom, once ruled by Richard's arrogance, was now filled with something else. Respect. The executives looked at Mary not as a custodian, not as a background figure, but as their leader. For the first time, they truly saw her. Mary's voice broke the silence, softer now but firm. "We're going to rebuild this company. Not with fear, not with arrogance, but with respect for every person who walks through these doors." And in that moment, the janitor who had been invisible for years became the woman who changed everything. Richard Adams was gone. The reign of cruelty was over, and Mary Johnson, the quiet custodian, had just swept the last piece of arrogance out of her company. After Richard Adams stormed out of the boardroom, the silence that followed was unlike anything the company had ever known. For years, his voice had dominated every meeting, every decision, every corner of that glass tower. But now that voice was gone, and in its place stood Mary Johnson, the woman who had once been invisible, now revealed as the rightful owner and leader. For a long moment, the executives only stared. Some looked stunned, others looked relieved. A few even had tears in their eyes. They had witnessed something impossible. The custodian they had overlooked, mocked, or pitied had just taken command of the entire company. Mary didn't bask in their shock. She didn't gloat or boast. Instead, she spoke with calm authority. "This company will change," she said. "Not tomorrow, not next year. Starting now." The first changes came swiftly. The layoffs Richard had planned were canceled. Workers who had been fired unjustly were contacted and offered their jobs back. Salaries for lower-level staff were raised. Benefits were improved. For the first time in years, employees walked through the front doors without fear of losing everything overnight. News spread quickly. Whispers in the hallways were replaced by conversations filled with hope. The story of Mary's revelation reached beyond the building, spilling into the streets, the city, and then across the country. Newspapers ran headlines. Custodian revealed as company owner, fires CEO after 15 years. Television anchors called it the most shocking corporate story of the decade. Social media erupted with awe and admiration. People everywhere were inspired by the tale of the woman who swept floors by day, but quietly held the power to sweep out injustice by night. But Mary didn't care about fame. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She wanted to build something lasting. A company where no one was treated as invisible, where no worker felt less because of their title. She started walking the hallways in her suit, greeting employees by name. People who once avoided her eyes now stopped to talk with her, surprised to find that their new leader actually listened. She set up open meetings where even custodians and receptionists could share ideas. "No voice is too small," she told them. "I was once ignored. That will not happen again under my watch." The culture of the company transformed. Executives who had once feared Richard's wrath now learned to lead with empathy. Managers who had treated workers as numbers were held accountable. Slowly, the building that had once been filled with tension began to feel alive with purpose. For the workers, Mary became more than a boss. She became a symbol. They called her the people's owner, a leader who had lived their struggles, who understood what it meant to be unseen, and who promised never to let anyone feel that way again. Outside the company, her story spread worldwide. Universities invited her to speak about leadership. Activists praised her for proving that dignity mattered more than titles. Young workers shared her name like a legend, saying, "If she could rise, so can we." Richard Adams disappeared from the headlines. His empire of arrogance crumbled overnight. But Mary's story only grew. She didn't speak of revenge, only of justice. When asked why she stayed silent for 15 years, she answered simply, "Because I wanted to see who people really were when they thought I was nobody." Her legacy wasn't just in the company's profits, which grew stronger under her fair leadership. It wasn't just in the awards she received for innovation and ethics. Her true legacy lived in the hearts of the people who worked beside her, people who now walked with their heads higher, knowing that even the humblest role carried dignity, and that true power sometimes hides where no one bothers to look. Years later, when people told her story, they never called her just a custodian or just an owner. They called her a leader, a visionary, and above all, proof that greatness can rise from anywhere. The woman they once whispered about in the hallways had become a voice that the world could not ignore. And so, Mary Johnson's legacy endured, not as the quiet custodian who swept floors for 15 years, but as the woman who swept arrogance out of her company and replaced it with respect, equality, and hope. Her story became a reminder passed down again and again. Never underestimate the one you overlook.